I'm here to talk about basic color management in a print shop, just so that you get the intuition of how it works. Now what I have here are the most common color spaces that we use in color management in a print shop. Now if we look at just these two for a while, what differs them from the rest is the fact that they're device dependent. That means they're of course abstract, just like any color space is, but they are dependent on a certain device, meaning that they represent all the color. Let's remember that these are three-dimensional color spaces, and they represent all the colors that a certain device can produce. So they are not constant, they're constantly changing, in other words, because these devices are physical and not abstract. Now if I look at just this one, this type, is based on the RGB color model of mixing colors. Looks like that. That's that kind of a structure. Now the types, the ones that I have here are color spaces that reproduce, that show the colors a certain monitor can reproduce. So these are, because in a monitor there we use the RGB color model of mixing colors, and so that's these ones. And then of course when we print with a certain printer, with a printing machine, then we use the CMY with a K, the CMYK color model. It's actually all-typical, but anyway, this is a simple picture, and so these are the device-dependent color spaces that are related to these. In this case, the devices are the printing machines. So you can see here an HP Indigo, an Exicon, an Inkjet, and so on. Now, there are of course color spaces that are device-independent. That means they just exist on their own. They're completely abstract and completely not related to any physical devices. And we have a one that's based on an RGB color model, the most common one being the sRGB, and then we have a one that's used on the CMYK color model. The most common one, at least in Europe, not predominantly, being the Fogra 39. And so the reason why we use these at all is because we want to be able to uniquely define colors. So if I have a certain PDF, and I'm working in prepress, and I'm working with a certain color in that PDF, and I want to be able to designate that color, I can't just give the RGB or CMYK values, because that's not unique. If I put that on a certain computer, on a certain printing machine, and I print, that is going to be different from a different device, because these devices differ since they're physical. And it's also going to be, if I concentrate just on that one device itself, it's going to be different. It changes with time. In 1 week's time it's going to be different than today, and in 2 weeks' time it's going to be different again. So that's why we have these completely abstract, constant color spaces. So that when I define a color, I give the RGB values together with one of these color spaces, so that that's a uniquely defined color. And the values are simply not enough in order to do that. Now the question is, how do I get from one to the other? Because I start in one of these. If I start on RGB, then sooner or later I have to go into one of the CMYKs. Because in the end I want to go into one of these, that again a CMYK type, because that's the ones that I use for printing. And I also want to be able to view the colors on my monitor when I'm working in prepress. And so I need to go into one of these, of course, in order to do that. And so we could define and find out certain paths, and these are called mathematical mappings, which would go from any of these into any other. But that would be that we would end up with too many of them. They do exist, they're called device links, and they're being used. But there's a general method that we use for a different one. There's a general method, and there we use a different color space in order to do that, and that's the LAB color space. Now these paths are called profiles, namely they're called IC profiles. And so what we do is, rather than finding many profiles that go from one color space into another, whether device dependent or independent, whether RGB or CMYK, we just find a profile, a path. We just find out how to get a mathematical mapping that shows us the way from any of these into the LAB. And once we get that, we also get a way back. So we get an IC profile for each of these, and that shows us the way into the LAB, and then we can go from any of these into the LAB, logically, and then we can go back into any other. So we can go from any one into any other. So that's cool, and these are of course abstract and independent of any physical devices and constant therefore, and so the mathematical mappings are there and you don't have to worry about them. But for these ones, these are constant, and these are not constant, and these are these are dependent on certain devices, and so you have to produce certain colors with these devices and then measure them, and then you hopefully have a program that will create for you the ICC profiles that will get you here and then back into any of them. Now, if you do that, just so that you do understand, cognizant of the terminology, for these, based on RGB color model for these color spaces that are device dependent, the ICC profiles are called input profiles. And for the other ones, for the printing machines, the CMYK ones, the ICC profiles are called output profiles. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you.